I find it ethically problematic to say that, okay, we need the most vulnerable people to continue to be vulnerable in order to drive sufficient decarbonization ambition. But also, I think we're starting to see that it's, aside from the morals of it, it's seemingly not effective, or at least the sacrifice of low-lying island states is not big enough of a sacrifice to motivate actions or sufficient action. So I don't know what would be. Um, so I find it very problematic.
Okay, hello and welcome to the Inevitable and Obvious podcast. I'm here with Páll Gunnarsson, and I am very interested to bring this episode to you because Páll, I met in New York Climate Week last year. We met while we were sitting next to each other. We were at an EDF event about solar geoengineering stuff. And I remember that after the panel finished and there were some scientists talking about like their approaches to research, what they would be willing to do in the future about this. And after the panel finished, you asked some very direct questions that I think surprised people in the room. And your direct questions were about why aren't we doing this? What are we doing about some of these like gigantic risks that are facing right now? It seems like we're talking and talking, but where is the action happening? And I turned to you afterwards and said, okay, we should talk more, because I generally feel similarly to you and am still learning more. So anyway, that was how we met. And at the time you were coming out of working in software and trying to figure out how to make an impact in your native Iceland. So welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. And what came next? Because you've done an enormous amount of things and seen some really cool accomplishments since then. So going back to September last year, what came next? What have you been working on?
Thank you. And thank you for reminding me how we met. That was a very interesting session. Perhaps I'll start by going over why I was in New York at all, because that was a decision I made 2 days before Climate Week. And the idea was basically that something significant was unfolding in Iceland. And I thought that people should know. And that something was the National Security Council process around the AMOC. Very quickly, in the matter of 2 weeks, the Minister for Environment, Energy and Climate of the Icelandic government had publicly announced that he would be putting the threat of a potential AMOC collapse before the Icelandic government. And then the Icelandic government escalated that to the National Security Council. And this was before any global media publishing stories about that. And so I went with the mindset of like, hey, there's something happening. You should pay attention to this, and talk to everyone that would listen and or that wouldn't listen about it. And so I arrived in New York with a sense of urgency, that I had been experiencing since basically I first read a news article about the more pessimistic trend that's been taking place regarding the AMOC in the scientific community over the last 3-4 years. And I think what you were referring to in that session, like it was this sense of urgency, this blatant urgency that perhaps stunned some of the participants. And a lot has happened since then. So this was late September. at that point, there wasn't a Reykjavík Institute. That was kind of the last moments of me being an independent activist. And then around the Arctic Circle Assembly, middle of October, I was organizing an event, bringing together leading AMOC scientists, climate intervention scientists, and Icelandic and Nordic policymakers. And so that became both an opportunity and also I felt that I required a little bit more institutional credibility, or I should start framing it that way.
I know how that feels.
Basically, on the back of that event, and also, of course, on the back of the National Security Council addressing the AMOC, a process started within the Icelandic government between the National Security Council Secretariat, the Ministry for Environment, Energy and Climate, the Foreign Ministry, the Prime Minister's Office, convening relevant experts and department leadership within the Icelandic government to kind of discuss how we should respond. And so a number of processes have been started within the Icelandic government. But one strategy that kind of immediately became externally noticeable was that the Minister for Environment, Energy and Climate, the ministry, decided to pursue effectively a global advocacy initiative, or at least an advocacy to the other Nordic nations, because we recognize that, we will not be able to meaningfully address this by ourselves as a nation of 400,000 people. And I mean, this in some ways was just giving interviews to global media, Reuters, CNN, Washington Post, and then I supported this initiative by, for example, setting up an op-ed publication between the minister and Johan Rockström that was published in Iceland and in Sweden, and that's kind of the first. That's the first public communication from the Icelandic government regarding how we should respond. That's the first external communication of what was kind of unfolding in private conversations within government about the response space. And so as it was defined in that op-ed, there were effectively three pillars of response options. And the first was, okay, we need to rethink how we look at climate risk assessments, which at least the mainstream or almost all of them reflect a linear risk assessment towards climate change. Do not, if they address, then they certainly peripherally address non-linear catastrophic risks. And so first pillar is we need to rethink it. Yep, jump in.
Well, I wanted to we'll come back to that. I wanted to back up a little bit and get more specific about what we're talking about here. So first is we're talking about the risk of AMOC collapse. And AMOC is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's the thing that brings warm air and water north from the equator up into the North Atlantic. It's what makes Europe and Iceland habitable compared to the other regions that are at that latitude. Something that you've told me before in a different call is that it hadn't really occurred to me is, for instance, I grew up in Arizona in the US in the desert. And so there are certain things that I learned that came from growing up in that particular biome. Like, for instance, to this day, I will not go anywhere without a full bottle of water because that's just ingrained in me from being a kid. And, for someone who's not from Iceland or who hasn't been there, something you told me is that you have a similar sort of background and experience with ocean currents growing up. So can you explain what that is? What is that about Icelandic culture that makes the ocean and currents so important? Like why does the threat of AMOC collapse land so much more with people in Iceland than maybe it does with people on the US Northeast coast, even though AMOC collapse would impact both?
Right. So I think there's 2 points there. On the AMOC, it's not really a complicated process. Is that at some point when we are kids, everybody gets taught that basically they never referenced the term AMOC as far as I can remember.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the Gulf Stream, but that we owed our, effectively everything, the habitability of our island, to the Gulf Stream. And so this is, for the first time, a climate threat that the Icelandic people just inherently resonate with. There isn't a need to very clearly or laboriously explain to Icelanders why the threat of North Atlantic Ocean currents collapsing is a devastating risk. It's just intuitively understood. I don't know where exactly in like primary school curriculum or I don't remember where I heard this, but everybody knows this. I don't think this is, however, unique to Iceland. I think this is true for certainly the Nordics, Scandinavia, the UK as well. But that's the let's say risk. That's the intuitive understanding of the people of this threat. That's the first characteristic. And then you could ask, why hasn't this become a phenomenon in the rest of the Nordics, for example? And here I think there's another very important societal dynamic that perhaps is more unique, even in the sense that Icelandic culture views risk quite differently than the rest of the Nordics. And that is due to the fact that we live on an island where we are constantly at threat from a multitude of natural hazards, whether it be avalanches or volcanic eruptions. And so both the culture and the governance system is quite attuned to working with low likelihood or high uncertainty, high impact events. And so it's more, let's say, attuned to, okay, it's fine. It's actually fine if we overreact, but let's react.
Oh, that's very interesting. That's so different from certainly American culture when it comes to preparedness for disaster. You mentioned earlier 400,000 people. I mean, that's I live in Seattle, and Seattle is almost twice that size, and as just one city. So there's a benefit, especially to governance, that comes from having a smaller population where you can actually interact with your government ministers. And something else is, a lot of them are younger, right? Like, especially coming from
Yes.
a U.S. perspective, like we've got this gerontocracy of so many old people as leaders who are often closed-minded about so many things. So explain what that is like as well, because it just seems like Iceland is in this unique position of, you are in a position of extreme threat and risk from AMOC collapse, but you have the benefit of governance systems and what you're framing here, this like cultural existence that makes it possible to respond to these types of risks. But I'm curious about the governance side of things too.
I would say you could definitely add that as the third pillar of like, okay, why is Iceland reacting? In that a little over a year ago, or the end of 2024, um, there was a national election, and we now have a new government um, consisting of three parties, one of them being the Social Democratic Party that has not been in power for over 10 years or around that. And there's been entirely a change of leadership in that party. And so the Prime Minister and the Minister for Environment, Energy and Climate, this is their first political position, and they're my age. The Prime Minister is 37, I think, and the Minister for Environment, Energy and Climate, 33 years old. And so I mean, I guess you could look at it from kind of two perspectives. One being, yes, they're young and perhaps perceive the world and the threats that we face with more urgency. Or you could look at it, well, this is their first political post, and perhaps they've not yet been kind of been inundated, yes, by the political process, and so they actually act rather than like, okay, let's wait and see. But in any case, I'm very happy with their response to the situation.
And that response is, I mean, I think it was in November, Iceland was the first country to declare like a tipping point risk of AMOC collapse as an existential threat, which has, I think, like, I mean, it's made a lot of waves. Like, it's caused a lot of people to take this more seriously. Like, what has changed since that declaration, both within Iceland, how you see like the rest of the world kind of responding to this? What's different now because of that?
I think there's a significant qualitative difference, and I mean, in one sense, it's simply just increased attention to the issue. It's people are interested in it, and I think both from the perspective of just the public, you can see like one of the global media articles that covered this was hit the front page of the Reddit World News subreddit, but also just in my conversations, whenever I'm reaching out to policymakers in the Nordics or in the EU, and I talk about this development, everybody wants to know more about it. People are very curious to learn more about it. And I think it's a mixture of, okay, whoa, I hadn't perhaps dove into the issue at hand, and I want to know more about that. But I think it's also an element of I'm curious about this act of declaring it a national security issue or even an existential threat, because that's just such a rare act of political courage that I think policymakers are just very keen to learn more about, not just the threat itself, but the political process. And so certainly this has facilitated, my own like advocacy efforts abroad, but also we're now starting to see both in the EU and in the States this declaration being used by advocates towards their respective governments in various ways. And, people are reaching out like, hey, there's a political opportunity in this European country. Let's collaborate. So it's still quite early to determine whether this will will end up being like a significant pivotal moment. But I'm at least observing very promising signs based on this.
There are a couple of different directions I want to go with this. One is, going back to Climate Week, like you were going because of this. Like, what motivates you? Why are you working on this? Like, if these things were already kind of moving and potentially happening in the government, why do you want to contribute to this? Because from my observations, it seems like you've made a big impact, and I'm curious what's motivating you.
So I haven't given this that much thought, but there's a clear, let's say, there's emerging a repeated pattern that I can comment on. So this kind of advocacy effort is not my. So while it's true that I had a career in software engineering, I started working on the climate change or climate issues. One career change before, and so I was already very much had grown aware of the fact that climate change is quite bad, and we're not doing the current trajectory is not one where we're having a good time in the coming decades. And so on like a macro level, there is that motivates me. And I have personally, I am very sensitive to working meaningfully. I've characterized it as I have a need to be globally useful.
Okay.
And if I find that my work is not if I'm not working along those lines, then I become very uncomfortable. So there's that. But
resonates.
concretely about this and the reason, my first reaction to reading a media publication about, it was I believe it was the Dietlevers and siblings paper on like a statistical analysis of AMOC collapse, summer of 24. My immediate thought was like, oh, I hope somebody is looking into this. Like, I hope somebody is working on this.
Mm-hmm.
And I did some digging around, like within the Icelandic governance system, and like nobody at the central bank was aware of the like macroeconomic risk implications. I couldn't identify anyone within the Icelandic governance system that I thought was, keeping, paying attention to this even. In the end, people clearly were, isolated pockets of scientists, whether at the Marine Research Institute or at the Met Office or university ecosystem. But there was no like policy track to focus on this. And so I had this, moment of like, okay, I better do something. Like, we're clearly not on track to address this, so maybe I should change that. And I don't know if this is like a continuous delusion of agency, but it's basically, I keep repeating this pattern of like, uh-oh, this is not being looked at in an adequate way. I should change that. And so that began my advocacy work in Iceland on the issue. And there have been a few different kind of repeated examples of this. I think probably the most recent was at a very eye-opening conference now last week in Aarhus. Arctic Science Summit Week, where basically the scientific community is planning the next 5 to 10 years of research, all the research relating to the Arctic, including, better understanding of global ocean circulation as a pressing research priority. But I came to the conference thinking, okay, the scientists, they know what scientific questions we need to answer, and they've got a plan to, I assume, address this. And my work is going to be to just bridge between that ecosystem or just, community and the political community or movement or momentum that's shaping. And then I go through all these reports, the IASC for like research priority, research gap reports, the strategic research plans of all these different working groups that then, tie into national research councils. And it's clear to me that even though figuring out ocean circulation is identified as a pressing research priority, the plan for the proposed research is not going to be sufficient to equip societies with the necessary capabilities to act on the threat. And so this is a continuous repetition of like, okay, somebody's working on this, somebody's working on what needs to happen, and then figuring out, actually, this doesn't seem likely to be. It's not enough. I better do something. So
Yes.
that's that's basically I think that explains why I'm working on this.
That I mean, that really resonates with me. My sort of wake up call was going to the Global Tipping Points conference last year in July,
Yes.
and there was all this discussion about these major risks, and then no discussion at all about what we might do about them. That just goes beyond the typical decarbonize. And I was like, that's crazy. Like we have to be looking at these things.
Complete mismatch between the threat identification and the threat response, strategy. Absolutely. But I would classify attending that conference along the same lines.
Yeah. So there's that leads to a strategic question, which is Iceland has declared this national security threat from AMOC collapse. There are potential interventions that could be taken that could reduce that risk. And they mostly, as far as I understand, fall under SRM, sunlight reflection, and trying to slow down the rate of Greenland's ice sheet melting and lowering temperatures overall so that ocean temperatures don't heat up as much. But there's a difference between awareness of risks and trying to like move that awareness out to other countries, kind of like what you've been describing. And then there's the research into like what might be done about it. What is that in your mind? What's the right, like from this national perspective, what's the right like sequencing or the right strategy to be taking for that, so that progress continues, so that it is enough to what you were just describing?
That is really hard to say, but I think a starting point to think about that is related to the idea of actionable, like early warning signals, I think. So let's say that some of the current initiatives to develop early warning systems for the AMOC or for the subpolar gyre or for the Greenland ice sheet are just very successful. And we can have a very robust observation / prediction, system that give us warning signs or warning signals that we trust. But if you look at,
sorry, real quick, I just want to jump in just to point out, like, we don't have these set up, right?
no,
Like,
we don't have these. No,
we
no,
really
no.
don't understand the like our perceptions of what the AMOC collapse risk is. It's like, it's maybe within some percentage range that's greater than 10% within the next 10 to 20 years, but we don't really know for sure. And what we're doing is we're modeling, we're in the models, we're projecting out what would it look like if the AMOC were to collapse, and then we're comparing our observed conditions with how similarly that looks to that model where AMOC is collapsing. And so that's how we're able to try to estimate whether or not this is a potential risk. But like, frankly, we don't really know, and the monitoring systems aren't really there. So that's
Yes,
right.
that's a correct characterization. But even in the theoretical best case scenario where we really do know, we have even less information about, so to speak, the effects of response actions. And so, I mean, basically, when it comes to decarbonization, our understanding is effectively, we believe that a lower concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would help. And like that's effectively it. Like that's basically our understanding. And this is really important when it's easy to just say, yes, okay, we need increased decarbonization ambition. But at this point in the game, like the damage associated with striving for 1.9 or 1.7 or 1.6, like these are incredibly differing, differently cost
The
expensive.
range of impacts would be,
Yes.
yeah, significantly larger with each 0.1 degree.
And we can't say that, we can't point to like a temperature range of like, okay, this is where we'll be so and so safe. I mean, we're starting to get some insight, but highly uncertain. And the same thing for interventions. We're now starting to see the first modeling studies that indicate that, for example, stratospheric aerosol injection or marine cloud brightening might help partially stabilize the AMOC to a degree of 3 to 4 Sverdrups. This is, I mean, if it's like this is an exercise, very theoretical exercise, because we're looking at incredibly uncertain modeling about the future trajectory of the AMOC, and then also incredibly uncertain modeling regarding interventions. But this partial stabilizing effect from climate interventions seems to maybe be like really, it may be the case that this would really come in clutch if we were able to implement the current policies for decarbonization, or even somewhat increase the ambition. I mean, if we don't achieve that level of decarbonization, then our current understanding of the predictions for the AMOC is that would probably not be sufficient. But
I mean, it's potentially the case that even if we could turn off all emissions tomorrow, that we're still in a very dangerous spot for AMOC.
Yes, that is the case. But probably if we were able to turn off all emissions tomorrow, my guess is that we would be, in a pretty good spot. But
better,
absolutely, certainly better. But this is the problem. It's like, okay, you have all this, theoretical notions for what could help, how much it could help. But if you're actually going to ask a politician to like, hey, do you want to sign off on, an SAI deployment? We think it might help. Like this is not really. I mean, it doesn't seem very politically feasible, at least in the current environment. nor even want it. I don't think I could
Yeah.
personally sign off on that. This is, and so there's clearly a lot of scientific work still to do with regards to the AMOC to better understand both its trajectory and how it would react to interventions, both climate interventions or more rapid decarbonization, before it becomes politically viable to take very significant action. And then you have to think about, okay, some of these climate intervention studies seem to indicate that the window for viable deployment of SAI, for example, in terms of stabilizing the AMOC, might be relatively short. And some studies indicate that basically only a deployment today or close to today would be effective in that regard. And a quote unquote emergency deployment down the line would not be effective, because you're not actually directly impacting the system. You're decreasing the temperature, which decreases rainfall, which decreases melt of ice, and so you're having like a few degrees of dynamics removed, impact on the system, and so acting early, it makes at least intuitive sense that would be more impactful. But so look at the timelines. The window for effective action might be very short. We may pass it, within the next few election cycles. We don't know enough yet to actually take, dramatic action. And so that needs to be urgently advanced. But we also aren't ready to deploy any interventions.
No, definitely not.
And so the way I look at it is that if we are going to wait now until we hopefully, further the monitoring, prediction, early warning systems until we reach some point of like political actionability, and then we would say, oh, okay, this is bad. Let's progress with the, creation of intervention capabilities. And we then have to do like a 10-year research period before we can actually take the response action. Then that is likely going to be too late, or possibly going to be too late. And so the case that I have today is we need to, in parallel, develop the better understanding of the AMOC and its response to our response, or how that affects it. At the same time, we need to develop our intervention capabilities so that if we reach a point where our understanding confirms the pessimistic trend that we're now seeing in the science and becomes politically actionable, that we actually have the capabilities ready to react. Mm-hmm. That we, don't stack these timelines.
You want to be doing stuff in parallel, not in sequence, because the sooner we deploy, if we're going to deploy some sunlight reflection, the sooner we do it, the better.
Yes.
And I completely agree with that. And also agree that we are not ready to do that. We shouldn't be saying that we are. You wrote an op-ed for SRM 360 recently that I was very good and had some arguments that I know that you've made, but I don't really hear other people making very much. And one in particular was about the classic moral hazard argument. So this comes up in every single conversation about SRM, about, is this going to reduce the drive, the motivation for society to continue to decarbonize? But I mean, your framing of this is that there's another moral hazard to consider here that isn't really brought up very much, about the people who are living in vulnerable locations around the world. Can you expand on that and help explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I can. so I wrote like a short post or article recently where I kind of looked at this notion of moral hazard more deeply, both the strategic or tactical underpinnings or foundations, and the ethical implications. And the term that I came up with that I thought was very fitting was enforced vulnerability. And so in this op-ed for SRM 360, I make the case concretely, speaking to my fellow Icelanders now that our government has categorized or communicates the AMOC collapse as a potential existential threat. What can we learn from now in the climate space? And so if you take the low-lying Pacific islands or small island developing states, their existential risk or the existential threat that they face from rising sea levels played a very important role in the 1.5 degree
Yes.
target in the Paris Agreement process. And I think I think we can say that was basically the height. Yep. What's up?
Can I just jump in just for people who might not be aware? My understanding of that is during the Paris negotiations, there was a lot of agreement around 2 degrees being the target that should be set, that we don't want to exceed. And it was not quite a last minute, but it was later in the negotiations in which different small island countries were really pushing that we should actually set like a stretch goal kind of thing of 1.5. And so that's how we ended up with these like 2 different goals of 1.5 and 2, like definitely not higher than 2, but if we can, we should stay below 1.5. And that was because of the small island nations that were pushing for that. That's just the context.
Or their advocacy was championed by people involved in the process. That
yes,
or taken on. Absolutely. And I think we can characterize this as basically the highest possible advocacy achievement that they could reach with given the threat that they face. Like, this was a huge success. But now 10 years later, like, they are still expected to go to disappear. Like, we're not on trajectory to actually save those island nations from disappearing into the ocean. And so this should be in my mind, a cautionary tale for Iceland and for the Icelandic government, in that advocacy based on moral standing should be employed, but I don't think we should leave ourselves with zero agency in actually addressing the threat. I don't think we should leave ourselves vulnerable to the rest of the world decarbonizing. Because if we go then back, because I think we should have agency in our future survival. Don't have to make it more complicated than that. I think that's a very simple argument. But if you tie that back to the moral hazard argument, which some find this probably very unfair characterization, but the way I characterize it is, all right, the parallel I find works best is fighting with your backs against the river. So an army that fights with its back against the river doesn't have the option to retreat. And so, win or lose, it's got to fight its way to victory. And climate intervention is a moral hazard to decarbonization, while perhaps to some degree accurate. We are forcing human societies to fight with their backs against the river. And this is never really, explained in detail. This is always framed abstractly, as if humanity is somehow uniformly with its back against the river. But that's, of course, not the case.
Yes.
The most vulnerable people in the world will continue to be the most vulnerable and will be the first to be devastatingly impacted by climate change. And so I find it ethically problematic to say that, okay, we need the most vulnerable people to continue to be vulnerable in order to drive sufficient decarbonization ambition. But also, I think we're starting to see that, it's, aside from the morals of it, it's seemingly not effective. Or at least, the sacrifice of low-lying island states is, not big enough of a sacrifice to motivate actions, or sufficient action. So I don't know what would be. So I find it very problematic.
I agree. I find your argument really compelling. I mean, and this is in response to the people who would say it's so interesting that there are so many people who work in, so many scientists and researchers who are well aware of these extreme catastrophic risks, and yet still push against even researching the notion of sunlight reflection or other interventions that might be helpful. Like, and you're saying, like, it's problematic that these people are saying this while there are entire populations around the world that are facing existential threat from this. And if they were facing existential threat, then perhaps their opinions would be different on whether we should be looking into interventions that might avoid that threat.
Perhaps not. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's another Pandora's box entirely, trying to unravel what is actually, the underlying moral framework of many people opposing SRM research. But yes, I think I'll just agree. Yes, I think it is very strange, and perhaps they would look at it differently.
I have this pet theory that just like during the pandemic, when and I don't know how much of this was unique to the United States, but is in like the early days of the pandemic, a lot of our policy approaches were being dictated by epidemiologists. So it was people who were concerned about spread of the virus and the way that could grow. And so decisions were made that ended up having impacts on populations, on economics, on the like the amount of increased mental health problems that came from this. Like those factors weren't necessarily taken into account by epidemiologists because that's not what they study. That's not what their expertise is in. And I sort of view this too, like researchers who are it's like this area talking about these risks and talking about the potential interventions. It's primarily up until maybe a couple of years ago, mostly been the domain of scientists. And scientists are trained to look at problems in a certain way, and they're not necessarily trained to be thinking about this like larger, bigger picture. And so you want more voices, you want more perspectives, different levels of expertise coming in to this. And I think that has been changing. And I think that's a good thing. One of the things that people will say these days in terms of how do we proceed forward with governance discussions and working on improving that and trying to overcome some of these challenges that we still face before we might consider deploying some interventions. One of the approaches suggested is bringing together a multilateral group of countries. This is kind of like what we've just been talking about. A multilateral group of countries a small number, maybe single digit number, who are then pushing the rest of the world at the international level to really start taking this seriously. And with Iceland's leadership on announcing that this is a national security threat, do you think that that is a role that Iceland will want to or be open to playing in terms of like that next step of like, okay, we've acknowledged the risk, but are we also going to move forward on asking for continued work and research into the responses to those risks?
First of all, on how I foresee SRM governance or intervention governance or research governance happen, or my theory of change, I think it's actually very interesting to point to one of the clearer evolutions in this field from within the past few months. The SRM governance NGO space was very focused on achieving or advocating for like a very global or near global multilateral governance solution to climate interventions, and I think the space is now kind of realizing that this doesn't really make sense and is probably not going to happen. I mean, the multilateral climate system is, I mean, I think it leaves much. It's not very inspiring. It's not very inspiring in tackling decarbonization, and I think many people are rightfully skeptical of whether such a system could be employed to tackle or to begin to tackle climate intervention research, or much less deployment at this stage. But we're seeing the field kind of transition away from advocacy for these global or near global multilateral initiatives towards, kind of a framework of just building it. And with the idea of, I imagine, building up to like a minimum viable scale of, a coalition of the willing, whether that be primarily kind of NGO oriented. It will have to include national governments or some sort of, formal government authority at some point. But so, for example, the SGRG initiative that's just been launched, the Solar Geoengineering Research Governance Platform by the Alliance for Just Deliberation for Solar Geoengineering, Environmental Defense,
NRDC,
the NRDC, Natural Resources
AGU,
Defense Council, AGU, exactly. I think this is a very promising development. I think this is both conceptually very promising, kind of transitioning away from these, what I perceive to be near impossible multilateral governance goals, to something that's much more achievable, and importantly, achievable fast and with urgency, because that's what's needed. Referring back to the timeline problem of us needing to do the climate science and the deployment capability readiness science in parallel today. I think having a more lightweight, minimum viable scale governance framework is the right approach, and I'm actually quite optimistic about this pathway forward. Whether Iceland could become the first or among the first nations to kind of co-opt a research governance platform like the SGRG, well, there's, I'm certainly hoping for it, and I'm certainly trying to make that happen. but I wouldn't dare to promise it at this point.
Certainly,
I
I
think
wouldn't ask you to.
uh, I think there's there's a logic there. As you mentioned, okay, they're willing to take this political risk in acknowledging threat. Would they be willing to take the political risk associated with endorsement of climate intervention research action? Definitely plausible. I think there's a few different elements though. It's uh, it's a different type of political risk, I would say. Whereas perhaps the first one with the AMOC as a threat, there's this the way I perceive it, there's this reputational risk perhaps of like, okay, really declaring something that than if the science actually turns out like, oh, we overestimated the risk. Maybe there's a risk of like looking silly. But with the climate interventions, there's a worst case risk of like generating a civil strife within the national climate/environmental space, that perhaps could um, torpedo their climate agenda just from the arising conflict or the political conflict. That's like one clearly different angle to it. But I think what's been very surprising to me, and I think there's now starting to become a realization that the narratives around climate risk and the associated response options has shifted so much in the last year. But we haven't yet kind of had the opportunity to update our perception of everyone else's perception to these issues. And so me and a collaborator of mine, Snjólaug Árnadóttir at the Reykjavík University, a law professor, we organized an event with civil society, media, and the government a couple of weeks ago at the Reykjavík University to kind of just initiate this conversation in Icelandic society. How should we react to this national security designation? And what perhaps came as a surprise to many people that followed this conversation is nobody was really pushing back on the idea of developing climate intervention capabilities. It's as if the idea had become normalized through the risk anchoring, and so this was not an event on climate interventions explicitly. I mean, we really just quite openly and honestly discussed, what are possible ways to reduce the likelihood of collapse, ranging from how do we mobilize further global decarbonization efforts to, climate intervention capability research. And I mean, even amongst those in civil society who you would perhaps beforehand have thought, okay, these are going to be political opposition to SRM research. The conversation just proceeded without any pushback on that.
Interesting.
And so I think we're in the beginning stages now in Icelandic society, at least, of understanding how perceptions towards the risk, towards climate risks in general, and towards the set of response options that are potentially viable to address that risk have been updated. And so these are conversations that I intend to pursue further in Icelandic society. And that might actually, if it is the case that we've all just updated, our views, and suddenly, okay, there's this climate risk that we intuitively feel, and then that has kind of brought with it a update in perception regarding climate intervention research, then this kind of risk towards the Icelandic government of torpedoing their decarbonization agenda by platforming climate interventions, then that gets pretty much, removed or ameliorated. And so I see it as a good chance that I see it as, I don't think it's going to be possible for Iceland to become, a clear first country to do this. Quite frankly, I don't think any government, I don't think any government will, no, yeah, I don't think any government will end up willing to be alone to endorse a deployment capability oriented research of climate interventions or SRM. And I don't think it would even make sense for any one government to do so. But as one of a collection of a few different countries in a sort of coalition of the willing, yeah, I think it's quite reasonable to think that will happen. Having said that, one could also make kind of a psychological argument that actually, for first-time politicians, the Icelandic government perhaps stepped so far into the spotlight by in a really courageous way of declaring the threat of the AMOC as so significant and so publicly, that perhaps there needs to be a recharging time. I do think that they probably feel very psychologically exposed by having done so, and not really seeing how it's playing out yet. And so that might play as a somewhat of a counteracting force, but I still think it's it's quite likely.
Very, very interesting. I hadn't thought about that aspect before of, you stick your neck out, and can you keep sticking your neck out, or do you need more allies to show up, or do you need to see progress or change coming from that before you take another courageous step?
I think you need to see at least, I mean, speaking from a personal perspective, I think you need to see some validation of sticking your neck out before you do it, before you repeat it, and what that exactly means, whether it just means other governments echoing this and taking the situation seriously, which we are starting to see now, which we are absolutely starting to see, that this, I mean, everything is moving so fast in this space right now. It's really hard to say, just come September, where we're going to be. And there's actually, I'm targeting September for, a quite significant development. Let's see.
Meaning you're working on something that you hope will happen by then, or you just think that 5-6 months from now there will be more significant progress?
No, there's a concrete timeline for potentially very meaningful initiatives from the EU. So, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. And because I envision this will be my kind of main task, or the main thing I'm working on for the next half year.
Yeah, please. I'm very curious.
So if I go back to the very beginning of this conversation, where I spoke about the three pillars of the emerging three pillars of response actions outlined in the op-ed between the Icelandic Minister for Environment, Energy and Climate and Johan Rockström, was like risk assessments, early warning systems, and reduced likelihood of collapse. And on the early warning systems pillar or dimension, in February, the Nordic Council of Ministers published a report, a Nordic perspective on AMOC tipping, and I highly recommend that report. Highly recommend that report for many reasons. But on the early warning system development, they identify the ongoing processes within the EU with the Ocean Act and with the now recently announced OceanEye initiative as key opportunities to institutionalize or to drive institutionalization with early warning systems. And so the OceanEye initiative that was announced in March, it's initially a 50 million euro fund. The money is not the big thing, but a fund explicitly to operationalize ocean monitoring regimes and ocean monitoring networks to bring them from this sort of soft funding competitive grant funding ecosystem that they all operate in towards a sustained long-term funding regime. And so the language in the initiative doesn't include AMOC or early warning systems, but it's basically exactly what we need. And this has been surfaced from my conversations with researchers from various Nordic Met offices, is that the biggest barrier towards kind of an institutional development of an early warning system is the funding landscape, is the soft funding nature of it. And there is a need for hard budgeted, which effectively means like parliamentary approved funding. And to achieve that, there needs to be, either there is a like multilateral governance system, for example, the EU, that kind of just funds this and dictates this as, okay, this is going to be something we need, this is critical infrastructure, we are going to do this. I don't think this is the most likely path forward. I think the more likely path forward is national governments make international commitments regarding development, deployment, and operationalization of ocean monitoring networks or regimes or capacities that they have and could contribute to a collective early warning system for tipping points or for the AMOC. And through that commitment, that then becomes the foundation for like parliamentary budgeting of those systems in those nations. And so this OceanEye initiative actually has a pledging event for national governments in September.
Okay.
And so the political action initiative that I'm working towards now is to have a handful of national governments show up to that meeting with the agenda of this needs to reflect our priorities in this ocean monitoring domain, which is we need monitoring of the AMOC and we need an early warning system for the AMOC, for the subpolar gyre, etc., for these subarctic oceanographic climate tipping points, oceanic tipping points. And there is good reason to believe that we will actually have multiple governments, make that case or lobby the EU for the OceanEye to become this platform that we can then make commitments to drive early warning system operationalization. There is a Nordic Council of Ministers meeting in May in Copenhagen, a meeting of environmental ministers. The Icelandic government have indicated that they will lobby the Nordic Council to follow up with the Nordic Council with the AMOC report that came out. Last week, the Finnish environmental minister answered a parliamentary inquiry in Finland with regards to their actions on the AMOC. That response was quite explicit in recognition of the threat, and she highlighted a number of initiatives that have been started within the Finnish government to address the threat. And so I think it's very reasonable that the Finnish government would be ready to join an advocacy effort with the Icelandic government. And then there is also a significant EU nation, another significant EU nation that might very well join this effort. I think it's a little too early to talk about it, but very promising signs.
Very, very interesting. Páll, this has been fascinating, and it's really cool to hear about all of that progress. You are a one-man think tank that is making an enormous amount of progress. So let's wrap up. Where can people find your work?
LinkedIn.
Okay.
In person. At conferences.
Great. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I look forward to seeing more continued progress from what you're doing, and of course, continuing to talk with you about these things as they progress. So thanks for coming on. This is really informative.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for a good or great conversation. This was fun.
Great. Cool. All right. Okay. I just finished up with Páll, and that was really interesting. I've talked to him a few times, and or a bunch of times really, and have really enjoyed watching the progress that he's made with the Reykjavík Institute. I think that Iceland's position in the world and the ways in which they perceive this risk are so fascinating, because the reason I started the episode with wanting to talk more about the way in which in their culture, like ocean currents are just inherent, they're innate to what they know and understand. I think it's really important and I will try to do this with more episodes of this podcast in the future, like each location, each country, each culture has their own perceptions of what the risks are and what the potential responses might be. And they're going to be unique and different in every single case. And when thinking about from a sort of zoomed out strategic perspective, what is the right thing that we should be doing for those of us who believe that interventions are probably going to be necessary for response to these extraordinary catastrophic risks? I think it's really important to zoom out and consider like what are the very specific different circumstances. And I know a lot of the people working in the field are already doing this, but it's been so clear to me as I've been talking with people around the world and learning about the like challenges they're overcoming and how they're going about doing it. And this was a great example about what's going on in Iceland and some insight into the Nordics. That last bit at the very end about this OceanEye fund in the EU is very interesting. I think that could be quite beneficial. And it's really nice to see leadership from politicians and from people who are thinking about this. I've been writing about that and calling for it, and so it's really nice to see from Iceland. And I applaud Páll for the leadership role that he has taken himself. So with that, thank you for joining. If you are not subscribed, you can go to inevitableandobvious.com and sign up for the Substack there, which means you'll get both my articles and the podcast episodes, but also feel free to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts Overcast, whatever your podcast player of preference is. And that's all for now, and I will see you next time.